So please welcome Dr. Joel Carter.
I think I'm okay. Is Mike okay? Well, good morning, eh? Shout out to my Canadian colleagues here. Welcome to Minnesota, Minneapolis. It's good to be here. They say that there are 4 immutable laws of the Spirit. They say that whenever we start, it's always the right time. Whoever shows up are the right people to be here. Whatever happens is the only thing that could have happened. And when it's over, it's over. So let's just dive in. I'll tell you something about stories, he said. They're not just entertainment, and don't be fooled. They're all we have, you see, all we have to protect ourselves from illness and death. Some people say that stories aren't really the important part of medicine, but I think it's really the most important part, these stories. So today we're going to talk a little bit about life through just 4 stories. I'm going to tell you 4 stories about 3 ships. I'm going to tell you a story about some rocks. I'm going to tell you a story about Guinness beer. And if I can pull that off, we'll see what happens. So, it was 1913, more than 100 years ago, when an ad appeared in the London Times in London, England, in December 29, 2013. And this is what the ad said. It said, "Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success." Does anyone know the name of the person who placed that ad? Exactly. This man, Ernest Shackleton. And this was the ad, this is the ad that he placed. And who in their right mind would sign up for a journey like that? More than 3,000 people applied for that position. And there were 26 chosen. And Shackleton had a ship. And do you know what the name of the ship was? The Endurance. And it was at the turn of the century, and it was in the heroic time of Antarctic exploration. In fact, you know that ad? It's sort of the same ad that we all signed up for. It's called Life. It's called Life. And this was the crew that set sail for the Antarctic. It was a time when we didn't know everything we needed to know about the Earth, and there were many expeditions that were racing to get to the pole for the first time. You may know some names, Scott, Amundsen. And actually, these journeys, as you see, the red line was actually a journey that Shackleton had, and he came within, I think, about 60 miles of the pole. And he had to turn back because the danger far outweighed the risk. So close. And he turned back. And when he got back to England, he told his wife that better to come back a live donkey than a dead one. And his wife paused, and after a few minutes eventually agreed. So the Endurance set sail, and after Scott and Amundsen had gotten to the pole, one with a successful return and one not, Shackleton set out on what was known as the Imperial Trans-Antarctic journey, where he was going to cross the pole. And he sent one ship. Anyone know the name of the other ship? The Aurora. There's another story. This is one of the most amazing human stories there is. But even so, the story of the Aurora that's not so well known about Shackleton's forgotten men is even as inspiring. And they set sail, and 80 miles from where they were going to put in, the ship was locked in ice in January of 1914. And they were stuck. Their ship had struck something deep. And they had to make camp for approximately more than a year on the ice. Beneath them was 22,000 fathoms of water. If you want to know what a fathom was, it's about 6 feet. And if I do my high school math, that turns out to be about 2.5 miles. And they lived on this ice floe with the Endurance locked in ice. And this is the team exploring and surviving together in community. One of the most important things that they did, probably, was to tell stories. Every Friday night, Shackleton, one of the most amazing leaders that we know of in terms of how he kept this group together. They would get together on Fridays, they would tell stories, they would put on skits, and they would toast to their wives and to their girlfriends should they never meet. And they played, and they survived, and they took care of each other. About in October the following year, the ice was cracking the hull of the Endurance, and they had to abandon ship. And they set up camp outside the ship. I think it was called Patience Camp. And they waited, and they waited. And can you imagine, back at the early part of the century, they were stranded pretty much like that Apollo ship was. It might have been like, how do you get back from the moon, for what we knew about the technology back then. And Shackleton kept his team together in one of the most amazing stories. Eventually, the ice pack began to break up, and they had to abandon, and they took off on a ship that they made, or actually 3 lifeboats. And it took them about 2 weeks to travel to Elephant Island, one of the most desolate rocks in the known world. And they made it to Elephant Island. And they were about 800 miles from the nearest contact and the whaling station on Georgia Island. And they fashioned one of their lifeboats with a top of a hull, and they made it waterproof as best they could. And Shackleton took off with 5 or 6 of his colleagues to try to go for help on a journey in the most horrific ocean there is, in a tiny lifeboat for the sake of the men and for their survival. It was an amazing journey. At some points of that, they had 60-foot swells. At one point, they thought they saw a funny horizon coming, and it was a wave. And can you imagine them doing a reading or taking a reckoning, which is a calculations of a ship's position based on the stars in those kind of waters? And if they were off, they were going to miss Georgia Island, and they were going to be off towards Africa, and everyone was going to perish. Eventually, they got on, and they came into Georgia Island, and they had to wait, and they actually had to put on the far side of the island with the whaling station over the mountains and cliff that had never been crossed before. Shackleton took 2 men, and in 36 hours crossed over. And the most amazing in ice climbing that other climbers now have taken days and days, and they don't know how they did it with a kind of, it wasn't about Gore-Tex, it wasn't about the crampons, it was 50 feet of rope and a heart that they knew that they had to get help. Meanwhile, the 22 were left stranded on Elephant Island waiting and waiting and waiting, wondering if they were ever going to get off that island. And when Shackleton crossed and came down to that whaling station, the whalers who knew him couldn't recognize him at all. And he said, "I've lost my ship." Can you imagine? It took 3 more months and many attempts for them to get ships in attempt to get to Elephant Island. And as that ship approached, finally, Shackleton was on the bow, waiting and looking. And he began to see his men, and he began to count. 1, 2, 3, 4. And when he got to 19, he knew that they were all there. That he had rescued his men, and the fact actually that actually if they had begun to make that journey, modern scientists think that they all would have perished. The only way that he could have gotten his men back was the fact that that ship got stuck in ice, and they couldn't complete what they thought out that they were going to do. This is them taking off in the James Cairn, and there were the men waiting for their leader to come. One of the most important things that he probably had was that he loved his crew. He loved his crew. One of Scott's team wrote that about Shackleton, for a joint scientific and geographic piece of organization, give me Scott. For a winter journey, Wilson. For a dash to the pole and nothing else, Amundsen. And if I'm in the devil of a hole and want to get out, give me Shackleton every time. And well, what did Shackleton say about this experience? He said that we had pierced the veneer of outside things. We had suffered, starved, yet triumphed, groveled down, yet grasped up at glory, grown bigger by the bigness of the whole. We had seen God's splendors. We had heard the text that nature renders. We had reached the naked soul of man. What a journey. Someone also wrote that you wait, everyone has an Antarctica. That the human journey, that we have these experiences, and this is also the illness narrative too. When your boat strikes something deep, when the test is positive. We all aren't going to get out of this life without the test being positive for each one of us. Right? So, and really, this whole story is really a story of life. So life. I sort of enjoy talking more about life now than I do about medicine. Because everything that I do in terms of the medicine is really broader than really the medicines and the solutions and everything that we do. It's about connections and it's about sharing stories. And we're all in the same boat together. The most important boat we live in is actually just called today, because we all have no guarantees. But life, available for a limited time only, limit 1 per person, subject to change without notice. How many people know that one? Provided as is and without any warranties, non-transferable, and is the sole responsibility of the recipient. May incur damages arising from misuse, additional parts sold separately. Your mileage may vary, subject to all applicable fees and taxes. Terms and conditions apply. Other restrictions apply as well. So in life, in terms of healing, they talk about from an indigenous perspectives, they talk about 4 universal healing salves that every indigenous healing system ascribes to, and that's the healing salve of singing, dancing, storytelling, and silence. So, stories. The universe is made of stories, not atoms. Rachel Naomi Remen, anyone know this author? Yeah. People gathered in circles, shared stories that enriched each other, filled each other with wonder, laid the foundation for healing experiences, and helped one another discover who we are in the midst of the mystery that we call life, which perhaps is really what, on one level, you're all here to do. It's about the storytelling circles and the sharing and the connections. The greatest healing powers seem to come from stories where there's great suffering. The shaman in the Siberian wilderness. They talk about if you don't know the trees, you may be lost in the forest, but if you don't know the stories, you may be lost in life. You have to have your own story. From Jewish perspectives, God made man because he loved stories, and the shortest distance between man and God is through a story. The African Bushman. The story was the Bushman's most sacred possession. These people knew what we do not, that without a story, you have not a nation, culture, or civilization. Without a story of your own, you haven't got a life of your own. And one quote that I really think is interesting and mysterious, because when I tell stories to my daughter and there's no answer, I ask her what she thinks, and she says, I don't know, Dad, it's a mystery. Life is mystery. The Aboriginal people in Australia say that the big stories, the stories worth telling and retelling, the ones in which you find the meaning of your life, are forever stalking the right teller, sniffing and tracking like predators hunting their prey in the bush. There are the troll stories from the Norwegian traditions. And you know what the trolls are there for? They're to make life difficult for us, so we can aspire and can push us and to find ways and to grow. Life will have its difficulties. So I'm from Canada. We have our own sort of history, our own sacred symbols of stories that are very important, that define us as a nation. And on behalf of Canada, I'd like to apologize for Vancouver and Sochi. In fact, I'll tell you, when I was in Winnipeg, looking to perhaps be recruited down to the States, and the negotiations, they got a little complicated until they threw this out. And I was wondering if I was actually going to come to Duluth from Winnipeg, the prairies to the sea, you know. And in fact, I sort of flew back once and I decided that, I wasn't going to do it because I had a good job and whatnot. But life, they say that, a ship is not made to be in harbor. You have to take the ship out to sea to test its mettle. And I thought, I was going to set sail for Duluth, and I was there for 10 years. Saw those Lakers and that sea and the healing powers of Lake Superior that I'll talk a little bit more about. But I'm going to talk about a patient that I met in Boston. Margaret was a 54-year-old woman with a lung cancer that where I practiced at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, which is thought to be one of the top 3 institutes in the United States where other cancer centers will send patients that they're having difficulty with. And she had a breast cancer that was one of the worst that the Dana-Farber oncologists had ever seen. And Margaret was very ill and she was in a lot of pain, and we did some tricks. We gave her some potions to sort of call back her spirit. Because if you're in pain, you're not really quite yourself. If you're not sleeping well, you're not yourself. How many have young kids? How many know what it's like to be psychotic? Right? Sleep is very important to feel better. Imagine if you have nausea and you're sleep deprived. Everything gets better if you sleep better. And we helped Margaret feel a lot better. And I asked Margaret this question, and I walked in with one of the medical students, and I said to Margaret, Margaret, you're 54 years old. And she had sort of come back. Her spirit was back. And she said, yes, I am. And I said, you've lived 54 years of stories. And she says, yes, I have. And I said, of all the stories you've lived, what was one of the best? And behind her was her husband, who had been with her through all this, had never left her side, one of the most dedicated individuals, nicest guy I've met. And she said, when I asked that question of what was one of the best stories, she said, when I met him. And so I said, how did you meet? And she said, well, I was a single mother, and I was working in a grocery store. I was with the cashier, and he came through the checkout line, and he asked me out. And I said, so what did you say? I said, no. But he was persistent, and so they eventually went out, and I said, well, what did you do? He said, well, we went out to a bar and we had a drink. And I said, so what did you order? And she said, a Guinness. And she said, a Guinness. And as I'm hearing this story and sitting next to, and the medical student is next to me, was really engaged in terms of her care, he sort of whispers over to me and he says, you know, this is better than any morphine that we've given her. And in the midst of that room, things had changed. Things had changed. It was palpable because of that story. And so we sent out for a stat Guinness. And we went up to the 8th floor of the Dana-Farber and the Brigham and Women's, and we found these beautiful flasks, and we poured them a Guinness. Understand, we don't pour a Guinness, we actually build a Guinness, according to the Guinness people. And sometimes the sacred symbols of our lives, just as their relationship began, coming back and finding rituals and finding important symbols that really have to do with someone's life story, provide those important healing experiences that, as a healthcare professional, it's a privilege and grace for me to be a part of. But you have to pay attention to the stories and ask sometimes the questions. Now, one of the other things we did is that I asked a whole bunch of other people the same question at Dana-Farber. And the best stories, the themes of terminally ill patients with cancer, when you ask them of all the stories you've lived, what was one of the best, this is what they say. Because wouldn't you be interested? You know, what at the sort of tail end of life, what's most important to people? Sort of teaches us how to live our life today, I think. And this is what they said. These are the themes. When we first met, cheese and crackers with mother, piano series in Boston, family vacations in Cape Cod, wedding day and daughter success with schizophrenia, the day I got married, the day in Africa when I helped someone die, infant son dancing MTV style, who's now dancing in Berkeley, adoption of twins, instant family, singing with children, my wedding day, snowmobiling in Canada, that was not planted. Can you imagine? Waking up with a loon by a lake in Sweden, and you know, I remember every one of these patients. Not that I know their names, I can place them by their life stories. When I saw my wife for the first time, on New Year's Eve party with friends for the past 30 years, business success with wife, motorcycle racing with son, marrying my wife, adventure with my husband in Belize, marrying my wife, stories with my 5 children when we first met. That story about New Year's Eve party, I know exactly who that gentleman was. He was a banker. He was a very sort of engineer, mindful, and I kept on asking him for, you know, tell me a story. And he didn't have a story to tell. And finally, I think the day of discharge, he came up to me and he said, Dr. Carter, I got a story for you. But it wasn't really any specific story, but it was a story of the stories that he told me. Remember him as if it was yesterday. And if you look at all those stories, they basically fall into 4 categories. They're either about family, they're about spouse and activities, or activities, but really, you know, I'd like to take editorial license. I think there's really only one main category of what these stories fall into. The most important stories we have in our lives. Something that doctors and in medicine we don't talk too much about. And I think as healthcare providers, you know, one of the things that in my field that we do is that we love our patients. We take care of each other. One of the magic about stories is that I also followed patients' pain. Before and after, I asked them, of all the stories you've lived, what was one of the best? And you know, pain scores get better. Without any drugs, without any methadone, without any of the complicated medications that we have. If you ask someone of all the stories you've lived, what was one of the best? Now there's 2 stories here that were really unique, and I thought, wow, that's impressive. And actually these 2 stories were neuropathic pain, which is a very difficult pain. I mean, how can a story help that? But look, and I wondered, well, what stories were those? You'd sort of think it would have been the wedding day, the whatever, when I saw my. But actually those two stories, one was the piano series in Boston and singing with children, interestingly enough. Made me think about those 4 universal healing salves of singing, dancing, storytelling, and silence, which is really all about the healing salve, I think, of something called creativity and maybe the art of life. So I said we're going to move on. We talked about some ships. We talked about Guinness. We're going to talk about stones. Charles Simic said in a poem at the end, he said, "I've seen sparks fly when 2 stones are rubbed together. Perhaps it's not so dark inside these stones after all. Perhaps there's something like a moon shining. Just enough light to make out the inner walls and the star charts." So stones have been an important part of human history, from Stonehenge to Australia to Easter Island. Human culture. You know what's at the center of Mecca? From what I understand, the black stone. Sacred. The 10 Commandments, Judeo-Christian, written in stone. And for me, I went down to Lake Superior after an event in New Mexico, after someone told me that I should listen to the women. No, I should learn from the women and I should listen to the rocks. And I began to listen to the rocks and see what they would teach me about life. And I began to play with these rocks on Lake Superior. It's amazing what you can do, the tricks, if you're really present in the moment, what might be possible. Sometimes the seemingly impossible is possible if you're really present. Spent a lot of time in the creeks. There was this crazy rock dock down in the creeks of Chester Creek doing this rock work, and people would come up to me and sort of stop their runs and sort of say to me, "You're just doing that for the heck of it?" And I sort of thought, I said, "Reckon I am," wondering what the rocks would teach me about life. The Inuit used rocks as important markers for survival in northern Canada. I'm going to jump to how the rocks taught me about my life and my family, because my father was born in Warsaw before the turn of World War II. He was in the Warsaw Ghetto. My dad survived very much like Anne Frank did, survived the Warsaw Ghetto. Years after I played with the rocks, my dad and we took a trip to Poland and to the camps where my grandmother lost her life. My grandfather was probably killed in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. That was my grandmother. And this is where, when the Germans emptied Warsaw, the Jewish ghetto, they sent those individuals to Treblinka. And this is a journey that my father and I took together. I was probably in my early 40s, but it took me 40 years to be ready for this journey. And the camp is being dissembled. These are the symbolic railway ties where the offloading from the trains occurred. And this was a few years after I began playing with the rocks, and as we walked into the central part, the heart of Treblinka, I turned the corner with my father, and there was nothing but a field of rocks and this huge Inukshuk structure, and for me to walk into Treblinka, it was like, of course this was going to be here. It was like a close encounter of the third kind, and it felt like home. For me, growing up being Jewish, I wasn't so connected to it because it was too painful. And sometimes you have to go to those painful places, and it took me 40 years to be ready for that. And to do the healing experiences that my father and I needed to do together, cross-culturally, and to really honor my grandparents. And so we did ritual by some of the rock. I brought some Lake Superior stone to place in Jewish tradition. In Jungian psychology, they talk about the rock as representing the enduring human spirit. And in Jewish culture, they talk about the rock as being on the lowest rung of the chain of life. But because it's at the lowest part of it, of the rung of the ladder of life, it contains within it the greatest potential. And we did our healing experiences there. And we did our time in Treblinka, in Auschwitz. Visited these camps. My father had an amazing experience walking the loading dock in Auschwitz, in Birkenau. It was actually the first time that the sun came out since we arrived in Poland. And my father sort of came back. He's a very scientific fellow. He's a doctor. I'm a doctor's son. And he came back to me, and he's having this sort of Buddhist experience, and he sort of walked up because it was a little surprising to him. And he said, you know, this peace came over me. I don't understand it. And I asked him, when was the last time that you were on a loading dock, Dad? And it was in early 1941, 42, when he was on the loading dock with his mother in the Umschlagplatz in Warsaw, where the selections happened. And my grandmother was selected to go this way, and he was selected to go that way. And he said to me, you know, it's funny, because it was a sunny day then, too. In our journey, we even met the woman that after my father was smuggled out of the Warsaw Ghetto, she just happened to be in Warsaw. She was en route to Paris. He had phoned her just to say hello, Hanka on the left. And she invited him over for tea and us to come visit, but my dad was a little socially inept. He sort of declined, didn't want to bother, and I said to him, are you crazy? And the stories that we had, you know. And we sat in front of the places where my father's father had him in the Central Park. And in the midst of that all, I sort of asked my dad, even in the heart of Auschwitz, I asked, you know, Dad, what do you think it means to be Jewish? And he said that in spite of everything, he had no regrets. And I thought, what an amazing thing to say. And so to sort of touch some of your parts, you know, of your history, I'll say that this rock right here is this rock right here. It's important for me to have a connection where I hadn't had one before, to acknowledge it, to begin to work with it, and to go to those places that represent more than 1 million life stories passed over this rock. Not just Jewish. Not just Jewish. You know. And then the rocks began to sort of change for me. It made something different, where you can do some magic with the rocks. The symbol changed, it transformed. And the most important thing when you want to build a structure that has durability, that has endurance, you know, it's not the big pieces that are most important. It's the small broken shards that you use to lock the rocks that make something enduring. It's really the broken parts are the most important. Sort of like life. I think the broken parts of our life stories really make everything else possible. When the Japanese men broke in objects, they agonized the damage by filling the cracks with gold. They believed that when something suffered damage and has a history, it becomes even more beautiful. You know, accepting those broken parts within our own life stories is so important for us to become who we are. It's not a weakness. It's not a weakness. So I talked that I was going to have 3 ships. This is the 3rd ship I'm going to talk about. It's a more North American ship, and the ship is called the Canista, and it's the Salmon Man, my friend Dave's ship up in Alaska, and Dave is a salmon man a fisherman. And he goes up and he fishes for salmon with his family, with his father, with his brother, with his dad. And one day, Dave is trying to get the catch of the day and beat his brother Raj to the opening, because you have a very specific opening to catch the fish, and there's this sibling rivalry. And Raj is up one of the rivers. Dave is miles behind, and he's trying to catch up to Raj. And so he's getting up the river, but he cuts the tangent, sort of tries to take a shortcut, and in life we know there are no shortcuts. And his boat's going along, and boof, he hits something. And he realizes that he's hit a sandbar. and he has seconds because the tide is coming. He has seconds to be able to get the ship back, or else they're going to be stuck. And he doesn't do it. And he's stuck on this sandbar, and in the midst of this huge sort of open expanse of water, to hit a sandbar is sort of like a loser move. And Dave is pissed because now Raj is up the river. He's going to get all the fish, and he's stuck on this stupid sandbar. And Dave is so mad, he jumps out of the boat onto the sandbar, begins to walk the sandbar, and has a tantrum. Dave is so mad, he is spitting mad. And he has hours to wait, and Raj is up the river. He radios his brother, "Hey, Raj, I hit a sandbar." He goes, "That's a loser move." "Are you okay?" "We're okay. We'll be okay." And he sits down, and he needs to wait. And he needs to wait. And his father's on the ship, and he's sort of seen his son have this tantrum, and he's just whittling away, and soon after the hours pass, the sea begins to come, the boat begins to rise. And as they're getting ready to catch up, there's a fish jumps. And Dave looks at that, and his dad looks at him. And his dad says to his son, he says, "You might be pretty happy to be where you are right now." And Dave took one of his nets and put it in the water. Seconds, there's a salmon. Does it again, salmon. So he decides to put his nets out. And he lies his nets out. And as these nets are out, pretty soon a salmon hits the net, like a pop. And then another one hits, and then a pop. And then a pop, 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 and becomes white water of fish hitting his net. And where he was, the sandbar had actually channeled all these fish into his net. And there was another boat just a little ways away that saw Dave was getting the catch of his lifetime, and it tries to sort of come in as they come to sort of get in, but he hits the sandbar, and he can't get there. He can't get into where the fish is. And Dave would say is that he didn't know where the bar was. He didn't get out and walk the bar. He knew exactly where that bar was. And as Dave is getting so many fish that one of his nets sinks. And to sink a net in Salmon Man terms is sort of like hitting that bottom of the 9th Grand Slam. That's like Sidney Crosby back in overtime. That's like, it doesn't get any better than that. And this other boat that's watching Dave get the catch of his lifetime begins to applaud and cheer him. And Dave takes his hat off and he starts waving back to this sort of ship. Now, if Dave was here, Dave would say, "Have you ever been in a place in your life that you just didn't want to be?" Have you ever been in a place in your life that you just have not wanted to be? So, Juan Antonio Ramirez says, "My boat struck something deep. Nothing happened. Sounds, waves, silence. Nothing happened, or perhaps everything has happened, and I'm sitting in the middle of my new life. My boat struck something deep. Nothing happened. Sounds, waves, silence. Nothing happened, or perhaps everything has happened, and I'm sitting in the middle of my new life." So what do you do when your boat has struck something deep? You know, I have this conversation with a lot of patients all the time. A lot of friends too, and you know, there's this little blue speck of dust in this universe. Way, way, way over there, and That's where we live. And the only thing meaningful that makes any sense to me is that we're really just all here to take care of each other. There's really nothing more important than that, which is really what this conference is all about. I said there were really 3 ships. There's actually a 4th. And it's the one that sailed in to Minneapolis. I'm going to leave you with some famous words from a famous Winnipegger. Winnie the Pooh. I don't know that, who knew that Winnie the Pooh is from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada? Aren't there some Canadians here? Do you guys know the story? You do? So in World War I, there was an infantryman who came across an abandoned black bear. And he took the bear with him to London, England when he was deployed and gave it to the London Zoo and was known, called the Bear Winnie. And that's where the author of A.A. Milne, I believe, came with his son Christopher Robin to look at the bear. And that's where the story of Winnie the Pooh started. So I'm going to leave you with the pearls about life from Winnie the Pooh and what he says about stories. When you're stuck. Bear began to sigh and then found that he couldn't because he was so tightly stuck and a tear rolled down his eye as he said, "Then would you read a sustaining story such as would help and comfort a wedged bear in great tightness?" I want to thank the organizers for the invitation to come and share a few stories. Privileged to learn about the great organization. Privileged to meet Sue and Mark. Hear about the great work and the research that's going on. Remember about the stories. They're so important to our lives and to our healing processes. Thank you very much. Anyone want to throw out any questions? I think a couple minutes, actually not too bad considering 10 o'clock, I think. Started a little late. Anyone have a couple of comments? I think you have a break now, is that correct? That is correct. Okay.
Small break, you can.
Okay, question.
You mentioned silence.
Yep.
Tell me about the silence.
A lot happens in silence. Yes?
The whole conference was worth your speech.
Oh, well.
So much.
Oh, privileged to come. Amazing, these life stories. We're all in it together. There's always losses. There's been a lot of loss in my community recently that you just don't expect. It doesn't matter if you have a diagnosis. We all have the same diagnosis. The only thing we all have is really today, and these amazing stories to make sense of what has importance and meaning, and the work that you're doing here, and the reason you're here is so important. So, yep.
Can you go back to your picture of the Japanese broken glass? I really
Yeah,
like this.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I thought that was beautiful.
I do have something to add. That's actually a concept called wabi-sabi, whereas as broken as something is how perfect it can be. And without any brokenness, a thing cannot be seen as beautiful in their culture.
Yeah.
Because it's the brokenness that can increase.
Yeah. This idea of perfection It's toxic. It'll kill us.
Thank you.
You know. That really, I think, accepting really that we have broken parts in our lives and our life stories, to go to those broken places is really the beginning of almost a new life. But sometimes you have to wait 40 years, sometimes you have to wait decades to get to that place. So. Okay. Anything else? There's a couple books outside if anyone wants to come by. You can hear a little bit about the stories and what the rocks have sort of taught me. Great privilege to be invited. Yeah, thanks so much.